Hi friends, and welcome to the online Consent Culture and Contact Improvisation Symposium. We have gathered some of the top innovators and thinkers around this important topic to share their ideas, push the conversation forward, and inspire inclusive consent-focused CI practices. Each presenter has made a video to precede the live symposium to share the essence of their ideas so you can become familiar with their thinking. We will go deeper during the live event, sharing ideas, having discussions, and experiential exercises. The following video is by Leslie Heydon, and their presentation is called The Color of Consent.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kathleen, and this is my close friend Leslie, and I'm going to be interviewing her today for her presentation for the Consent Symposium. Hi, Leslie. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Kathleen. Yes, my name is Leslie Heydon, and I live in Toronto, Canada, and I've been dancing contact improvisational dancing for 3 or 4 years now.
So what are you talking about today, Leslie?
I'm going to talk about consent and race in contact improv dancing.
And I've heard the term frequently person of color, and for the people listening, what would you say would be the definition of a person of color?
It's a term used in the US and Canada to describe any person who is not considered white. It was used as far back as 1796 to refer to light-skinned people who are mixed African and European descent. It was used to describe people who weren't as dark as slaves, who were called Negroes or colored people or Black, but it was used to describe people who were somewhere in between but were not white. Today, the term is used to describe someone who is not white, someone who's not of Caucasian ancestry. So what does it mean to not be white? Something I've noticed is that when I'm out and about in the world, other people of color recognize me as a person of color, especially Black people. They recognize me as Black or someone with African heritage. And it's almost always unspoken, and it's almost, it's hard to describe. It's a subtle recognition. Sometimes it's just the way someone might give me a slight nod. Sometimes it's a little smile. It's a look, it's a posture that says, ah, yes, I recognize you. You're like me. And it has to do with how I look. If someone were just talking to you on the phone, it might not be apparent. So one of the key things about this is it has to do with how people look and how we see people.
What is or are your definitions of racism, and are there different types?
So I distinguish between individual racism and systemic racism. Individual racism refers to an individual's racist assumptions, beliefs, or behaviors, and is a form of racial discrimination that stems from conscious and unconscious personal prejudice. So for example, not renting an apartment to someone because they're from a race or a culture that you have a bad idea about. Oh, that group doesn't pay their rent on time, or oh, that particular group is dirty, or that kind of group is involved in the drug trade. Then there's systemic racism, and it includes the policies and practices entrenched in established institutions, which result in the exclusion or promotion of designated groups. It differs from overt discrimination in that no individual intent is necessary, and it manifests in two ways. So one way is institutional racism, racial discrimination that derives from individuals carrying out the dictates of others who are prejudiced or of a prejudiced society. The second way is structural racism. That's inequalities rooted in the system-wide operation of a society that excludes substantial numbers of members of particular groups from significant participation in major social institutions. So if one grew up in North America, one grew up within our society's systemic racism, and we have absorbed racist institutions and structures. I don't know if you remember that old commercial. It was for dish soap, and there was a woman named Madge talking to someone, and there was a woman soaking her hand in something, getting ready for a manicure, and Madge would say, "You're soaking in it." So in that sense, we're all soaking in it. We're all soaking in systemic racism. So it's not a question of, am I racist? Or is somebody racist? The pertinent question is, am I anti-racist? Am I doing the work of bringing my racism into consciousness so I can make conscious choices? And so I can challenge racist assumptions and beliefs within myself and challenge racist systems when I encounter them outside myself.
What are some of the myths about racism?
So I'm going to talk about two that I think are relevant to this discussion. The first one is the myth that racism is intentional, or I'm a nice person, I'm not racist. So if I have no intentions of offending someone, how can anything I say or do be racist? And if I have no consciousness of the racial biases I've absorbed, I could feel resentful or threatened for being accused of racism. So if someone says, you know what, when you say that about that group, that's racist, I might be going, oh, no, I'm a nice person, I'm not racist. And so if I'm not paying attention to the ways that systemic racism affects people, then I'm not being anti-racist, and I'm probably unconsciously perpetuating those systems. The second myth I want to talk about is the myth that certain enlightened or groovy communities are egalitarian and contain no racism, i.e., contact improv dance communities are nice and there's no racism in them. We're all equal on the dance floor. This belief that we're all equal rejects the reality of racism. It rejects the reality that we grow up in a system where there are a lot of inequalities. And when we deny the presence of racism, there's no space for the reality of people of color. And when someone thinks or says out loud that we're all the same, that's denying my reality and my experiences and the experiences of many other people. And it doesn't feel good to be self-expressed in a place that doesn't accept my lived reality. And there's no ground on which to build anti-racist awareness, policies, and systems.
So my dance company, Raison d'Etre Dance Productions, in co-production with you and facilitated by you, has been running POC jams in Toronto for almost 2 years. So I was wondering if you could let people know what a POC jam is and how has it been going in Toronto?
So a POC jam is a jam for people of color. It's an affinity space where people of color can come together to learn and practice contact dance without the presence of white people. And why that's important? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is that it allows for a degree of comfort, sometimes consciously, sometimes even unconsciously, when people of color know that they don't have to be on guard because there are white people there who are part of the dominant power structure.
And how has the jam in Toronto been going, the POC jam?
One of the things I noticed is that 90% of the people who attend the POC jam never go to any of the regular mainstream jams in Toronto. And why is this? Well, here's what people have told me. They've said that they're afraid to attend a mainstream jam because they might not be welcomed, or they're afraid no one will dance with them. They've said that they don't feel comfortable at an event where the majority of people are white. And they said they don't feel safe when they don't know the politics of the people they're dancing with because they don't know a lot of people there. And some of them have said also that they're tired of facing microaggressions when they want to go somewhere to dance.
So you used the term microaggression. Could you define that for the listener?
Microaggressions are subtle interactions that aren't overtly racist, but that still have an impact. So for example, there have been quite a few people who have come up to me asking me questions about the Person of Color Jam. And one of the things they'll say is, how much color do I need to have in my skin to come to the jam? Thinking that this is a really funny joke, when in fact, that's a microaggression. Another one is people coming up to me without asking and grabbing my hair because the texture is so fascinating and they just really want to know what it feels like. So that's a microaggression. That my body, my appearance is something for somebody else's curiosity.
I've been out with you when that has happened as well, so I've seen that. And they don't ask permission; they just touch your hair.
Yeah. Exactly.
And they're not touching my hair. Yeah.
That's right. It's something that happens without consent. I want to tell you about something else I've noticed about the People of Color jams. The other thing I've noticed is who doesn't come. Mm-hmm. So I do attend the 2 regular mainstream jams in Toronto, and there are some people of color who regularly go to the jams. It's a small minority, but there are a definite group. And none of them, except for one, has ever come to the Person of Color Jam.
Why do you, I mean, it's hard to know because you'll be guessing, but what is your best guess or guesses at why?
I think that one of the reasons might be that people of color who are regulars in the contact community don't want to feel singled out and don't want to deal with explaining why there is a Person of Color jam or why they might want to go to it if they're already attending the mainstream jams. I don't know, but that's a guess. Regarding the people of color regulars who attend the mainstream jams in Toronto, I have a hunch that many white contact dancers, when they see us, these people of color who come, that they think, oh, look, this is evidence that this is an egalitarian space and that there is no racism here and that, you know, there are no issues for people of color attending mainstream jams. And I'm speculating here. Well, I'm doing a combination of speculating about others and looking inside at myself at some of the thoughts and feelings I've had about this. That to be someone who goes to regular jams and then to decidedly go to a Person of Color jam or facilitate a Person of Color jam, it could be seen as an affront. It could, you know, I myself sometimes have been concerned that white people I know in the community would think that by me doing that, it's a way of me saying, oh, this is, you know, the regular jam's not good enough for me, or there's, you know, I'm not comfortable in this space. And that it challenges that myth of the egalitarian contact space.
Could you talk about the experience of going to a Person of Color jam, bringing home truths, the pain of the realizations that can come when you go to a Person of Color jam? I know we've talked about that sometimes.
I have a friend who's a person of color who has told me that part of his journey in starting to confront and do work on his personal wounds around being a person of color, that in order for him to do this work, he had to be willing to face the grief that he had of growing up in this society being a person of color. And I know that for myself, when I attend people of color events, that a combination of things can happen. Sometimes I experience a sense of comfort that I didn't even realize was missing before. And with that can come grief and pain. Yeah, it makes palpable, it makes palpable the racist institutions and the racist society that we all exist in. And sometimes ignorance is bliss. Sometimes it's nice to not have to confront those difficult emotions and feel those pains and griefs.
How does racism fit into consent?
So you know how when you're walking down a busy street in a city and there's a lot of people on the sidewalk, and sometimes there's people passing and there's not enough room for everybody on the street at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever noticed who moves and who doesn't move? I started thinking about this some years ago, and I started noticing that yes, men more frequently did not move out of the way and seemed to expect me to move, and especially white men. It was also common with white women, but it was the most common with putting together white and men. That was the group that moved the least often. When I started noticing this, I started playing with it.
Mm-hmm.
I decided to stop moving and see what would happen. And I noticed a few things. So I noticed that sometimes when I wouldn't move, people would look surprised. Oh, and then at the last second, kind of to avoid a collision, they would move. Sometimes they would look annoyed, like, what's going on? Sometimes they wouldn't move, and then they would look really shocked or flabbergasted if there was a collision. We were negotiating a sort of consent, non-verbally deciding who had priority of space. So after I started noticing the sidewalk phenomenon, I brought that awareness into clubs. There was a time in my life when I went to a lot of clubs that played urban music, clubs that had DJs, clubs where there was a lot of dancing. And what I started noticing when I was in a venue where the crowd was predominantly white, I found that my personal space was frequently impinged upon. I noticed it when I would be making my way around, walking in a club or going up to the bar to order a drink or standing watching a DJ. And I also noticed it when I was on the dance floor dancing. So it ran the gamut from me standing still in one place and someone needing to get by, but not bothering to move to go around me or not saying excuse me, but simply bumping and jostling right into me and expecting me to move out of the way. Sometimes it would be if I was on the dance floor and I was, in my zone and somebody else was in their zone, suddenly their zone would start to move into my zone and their hands or their feet would be moving into my space. And again, like on the sidewalk, when I stopped moving out of the way, when I stayed where I was in my space, I would be met with a bunch of different responses. Sometimes astonishment, sometimes aggression. Sometimes there was even, this was a strange one, people would even kind of pretend it wasn't happening. Like they'd be bumping into me, but like not looking at me. I also noticed when I was in venues where the crowd makeup was much more culturally diverse, that this didn't happen nearly as much. There tended to be a more common negotiating of space that felt more equitable. And there's one experience that stands out for me. When I was visiting Brooklyn, I went to a club one night where the crowd was 99% Black. And it was a small club and it was packed to the gills. It was impossible to negotiate moving around without touching other people. And what I found there was not once during my entire time there did someone bang into me or jostle me. It was astounding. What I noticed was when I needed to move somewhere, all I had to do was look at the person who was in my way that I needed to move past. And if I simply looked at them and made eye contact, they would look back and they would shift wordlessly to make it easy. And the same thing happened when someone needed to get past me, they would just look at me and then I would move and then they would move around. There was a wordless yet beautiful negotiation of consent and space.
In your description just now of negotiating space, I can really see how space negotiation could play into a contact improvisation jam. So how does this theme of racism and consent play out for you in jams or in the contact improvisation community?
I don't think I have definitive answers, but I can tell you my thoughts and questions about it. And I can talk a little bit about my personal experiences. Contact dance is a physically and energetically intimate practice, a practice that's improvised in the moment. I believe that to be able to improvise in the moment, one needs to be present inside oneself and not necessarily thinking about what's the next move, what's this person going to do. And to do this intimate dance, it takes something. So it takes enough courage to self-express in the moment, improvise without being able to think or plan. It takes enough safety to trust oneself and one's ability to create and maintain boundaries in that flow, in that intimate flow. It takes enough trust in the others that one is dancing with, enough trust to allow another person to rest their being and their body on me, enough trust to allow myself to rest my being and my body on somebody else, enough trust that I can fall safely if my support disappears. And I say enough here because I don't believe there is such a thing as complete and perfect trust or complete and perfect safety. So I'm talking about not perfect trust, but enough. So these conditions I've just talked about, the conditions that I think are helpful to be there to dance contact, it takes something to step onto the contact floor, to step onto the dance floor and do this. So now imagine stepping onto the dance floor with the additional conditions of racism and operating in a racist society. I think that on top of all those first conditions, to then be negotiating all the dimensions of race and racism, for some people, it's just too big. It's too much. And it's going on under the radar, outside of the awareness of the majority of people who tend to be white. So in a way, it's an invisible struggle. And it's a struggle that I know I don't always feel safe or comfortable to talk about with my contact dance friends who are not people of color.
If the issues of racism are invisible to many people, how does that affect you to negotiate consent in a contact dance if those issues aren't visible with the person you're dancing with?
I don't even know if I have an answer for that, Kathleen. Yeah. How do I do that? You know what? As someone who grew up in a white neighborhood and who went to schools that were predominantly white and who has participated in many activities that were predominantly white, the therapy training program that you and I both went to where we met, all the instructors were white. Many of the students were white. I think that it's an unconscious negotiation I've been doing my entire life that I'm not always aware of.
Mhm.
What I do know, though, is that I've learned through experience that I can't trust that white people will engage in nonverbal consent with me and will respect my space. Yeah, I've learned that I can't trust it on a sidewalk and I can't trust it in a club. I'm sure I carry a level of watchfulness and unease and distrust when I'm in mainstream contact jams. That when I'm in a space with only people of color, I can undo some of that vigilance that I've lived my life with.
Understanding that contact improvisation does not escape the racist issues of our society. What can we do about it? And what can white allies do?
Well, one thing that occurs to me is get some education. Attend a white ally training course. Do some reading. But in the meantime, I'm going to do a costume change.
So if I want to be a white ally, I need to, if I'm understanding correctly, educate myself on the issues and start to ask myself questions which might be uncomfortable. Did I get that right?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. These processes might not be comfortable. Asking yourself these questions might not be comfortable. And I'll speak for myself. Just because I'm a person of color doesn't mean I have all the answers. I grew up in this society as well. I have unconscious, ingrained biases, and it's not comfortable for me either when I come face to face with something inside myself. And it can be scary to admit it to myself and to others. So I tried an experiment. You may have noticed that I shifted my appearance a few times as we went through this interview. For you, the viewers watching this is an exercise you can try. You can think back to the different ways that I appeared and pay attention to how that impacted what you were hearing. You can notice if me looking one way or another way made it easier or harder to hear what I was saying or understand the message. You can notice what came up inside of yourself as I shifted my appearance. So as I said earlier, growing up in North America, we're all steeped in the racist tea. And paying attention to what came up for you as I shifted my appearance could be a clue to what may still be some unconscious biases that are lingering in the background. So I'm talking about layers of awareness. There's an awareness that's necessary for dancing contact, and there's an awareness that's necessary to act within consent. And then there's the awareness of race and culture. So how do we weave these layers together in a way that's cohesive? How do we hold these layers while immersing ourselves in the dance? I've heard a few people say that some of the jams in Toronto now are too political. Most of the people that I've heard say this are white. Could it be that the freedom to move in a space without considering the political awareness of race and consent is much easier for members of the dominant privileged group? You know, that ability to get lost in the dance without thinking. I want to create a space for those of us, the people of color, who are not members of the dominant group, a space in which we feel safe enough to immerse ourselves in the dance without thinking. So you were asking, how do we do this? How do we accomplish this? It's a good question. I don't have a lot of answers. And why should someone care if they're not a person of color? Why is this even important? Well, don't we all want to dance with people who want to dance with us? With people who feel safe when they're dancing with us? So I have these questions, and I have a desire to explore these questions. I want to explore them through talking, through moving, and through dancing. And I hope we can do this together.